everyone, welcome to my Pastor Paul Friday update. Actually, today, Pastor Steve interviews me. I'm usually the one doing the interviewing, but today he's going to interview me because we're talking about why we're wearing masks and social distancing in worship. It is a heartfelt conversation that I hope you stick around for. Before we get to that, a couple things you need to know coming up here at St. Mark's. The first one is this. This weekend, we have 6 services total, 4 in-person services and 2 live streamed services. The other thing we want you to know is that we have a digital connection card that we're working on and that we're going to utilize for everybody to be able to say, hey, I'm here at St. Mark's. We'll still have some print cards in person, but we want you to know about that as well. Finally, I'm so excited that next Sunday, we're starting a new series called 3D Mission, and we have a couple people that we get to interview on Sunday mornings. One is Keon Carter. He is the pastor at Wellington Heights. He kicks us off November 8th, and I'd sure love for you to be there. So just so you know, this weekend, 6 services. Next weekend, we start a new series. God bless you as you connect faith and life. Check out this video.
Hi, everyone. I'm Pastor Steve, and today I get to interview Pastor Paul about some difficult decisions that we've had to make over the last several months due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Pastor Paul, I remember vividly when we had to close down worship for the very first time. It was March the 22nd. It's now the end of October, and COVID's still around, but we have found all kinds of ways to connect with people in their homes, online, and now with in-person worship. Talk to us, if you will, about what went into the decision to suspend worship originally, and then what has led us to the place where we've been able to meet again in person.
Yeah. Well, this is a lot of fun for me because I'm usually the one that's doing the interviewing, and so you get to interview me. This is great. I know these are tough topics, and these are tough questions, and these are tough times with COVID. And so I really appreciate the opportunity just to share my heart for this. I hope that I present maybe a different view on this whole situation with worship, with gathering together, with wearing masks or not wearing masks. And hopefully I present something that people understand really comes from my heart and is deeply theological. Yeah, I remember back in March, I mean, it just seems like forever ago, we find out basically that the state has asked us not to gather. And you remember those days, and we followed those mandates. And I think, when we think back to why we closed down worship and gathering in our facility, it was really in a response to the state and wanting to honor what the state had said. And I think as we got into summer months, we certainly introduced outdoor worship. And the reason we did that, and I remember that conversation very well as a staff, was I think I came in that conversation saying, okay, how many services can we do indoors at a time and things like that? And I remember the staff just had some beautiful ideas about saying, well, why don't we use our backyard? It's wide open and we can gather together out there. And so we transitioned to that, and then we started gradually bringing people back indoors when we felt like we had a good handle on the best way to do it. And I think that's always been our goal, is to figure out really what is a responsible way to handle this for everyone. And I think that's what makes it difficult a lot of times as a church, because we are so diverse in how we feel about COVID and the virus and how it's going to impact us and other people. And so it's been definitely a tremendous learning experience.
So Paul, one of the most difficult decisions we had to make was the call on social distancing and using masks. Could you say a little bit about what was the heart of that decision for you?
Yeah. For me, I've been studying this a lot lately. I'd say in the last 4 months particularly, really looking at Jesus' words about loving your neighbor as yourself. And then he extrapolates that into what we call the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And for me, I am so very concerned about, I would say, people who maybe don't know Jesus like I know Jesus, right? And how do I express to them that I care for them, that I'm concerned about them, and that I love them? In a couple of weeks ago, I did a study, part of the Disruption series, and I did some research on the Golden Rule and Jesus saying, "Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you." And it was interesting. In that time, there was Hillel the elder. You know him, and anybody who's done any New Testament research knows him. He was very popular among the Jews. And his response to how do you love your neighbor as yourself was basically this: don't do anything that would harm them or hurt them or that would be considered hatred towards them. So on one level, Hillel the elder was saying, as long as you don't offend them, you're following the law of God. Well, Jesus turns that on its head, because when he says, do to others as you would have them do to you, I really believe he's telling us that our job is not just to not offend people or to say, I know I haven't done anything that is hateful toward them. Our job is to figure out what they need to experience the love of Jesus in their life. That puts the responsibility on me. And you see that all the way back to Cain and Abel, I believe, where Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? And, we look at that and say, well, of course we are. We are responsible for other people. We are to love other people. We cannot just excuse ourselves and say, I haven't done anything to offend them, so I'm doing okay. So I think there's a responsibility for us, and for me, that's the guiding principle in the decisions here about wearing masks. We feel like the best way that we can love our neighbor is to not give them COVID, right?
Right.
I mean, I would think that most people don't want to get COVID, no matter where you're at on wearing masks or not wearing masks. I think, so if that's where people are at, I want to love them in a way that respects that. And so when we gather together, what we're trying to do is saying, we're not afraid of each other. We're not saying we don't want to be close with each other. God knows we are waiting for the day that we don't have to wear masks and we could have 400 people back in the sanctuary and things like that. But until that time, I think the best way to express love for our neighbor is to wear a mask and social distance.
Kind of on that same line, the Christian community has been divided. And of course, we have had our share of that here over people who really object to wearing masks. We've had some, and it's not just here, it's other places where they'll say, well, that's about fear, not faith. And I feel like you've talked about that, but could you say something a little more specific about that particular issue?
Yeah, that's really a contentious issue, I think, right now. And I've heard from every side of the story. And what I find interesting is that we're no different today than the early church was. We're no different today than the church that the Apostle Paul was working with. And I've been really thinking about a time that the Apostle Paul had to speak to the Corinthians, and this comes from Corinthians chapter 8, and he also mentions this in Romans 14. But if you're reading those areas, the Corinthian church had an issue as well that was causing division in their church, and it was whether or not to eat food sacrificed to idols. Now, thankfully, we don't have to worry about that today, but in Corinth, let me just give you the background on that. In Corinth, pagan worship often involved sacrificing animals. And so they would sacrifice animals, and then they'd cook them, and then they'd sell them in the market. And actually, it was probably the main staple of meat for most people in Corinth. And so Paul's dealing with new Christians, and which means that they were formerly pagan, And so he's got some Christians on one hand who are saying, I can never eat that food sacrificed to idols because that's just a terrible thing to do, and it's worshiping a false god. And then Paul has other Christians who understand that food sacrificed to idols is nothing, right? Idols are dead. We worship the living God. And Paul, his response is very interesting because Paul could have come down as an apostle and said, hey, this is how it is. You people that are still thinking that there's any truth to your pagan former way of life, you're just fools and you're dumb and, there's no room for you, right? He doesn't do that. Instead, he tells his brothers and sisters in Corinth who they get it, that know that this food means nothing. He says, but here's the problem. If you are eating this in the presence of other people, you possibly might be causing their faith to stumble. And so, long story short, Paul's concern is not about his own faith. It's about the faith of others. When I hear people saying things like, Christians saying things like, well, if I get COVID and I die, I know I'm going to heaven. I hear that and I say, okay, that's wonderful. I want you to know that. I want you to believe that. Now, I want you to also consider your brother and sister in Christ, or maybe even more than your brother and sister in Christ, your neighbor that doesn't know Jesus. They don't think like you. They don't understand that. They don't have that faith like you. You maybe say to yourself, I have faith and I don't have any fear of COVID. I think that's wonderful. I think that's great. As Christians, we are not to fear COVID, right? But what good does that do for your neighbor? See, this still comes back to loving your neighbor. And I think Paul understood that. James certainly did. James writes in James 2, he talks about faith living out in actions. And so James gives a great example. He says, if you've got a brother and sister in Christ who's naked and doesn't have food, it doesn't do any good to say to them, God bless you, I hope you're okay. James says, you got to act on that. And so, again, our concern is, how do I live my faith out in a way that loves people and brings them closer to a faith walk with Jesus Christ? I would even say that Paul believes that those of you who are stronger in faith, you need to have greater concern for those who are weaker in faith. He actually uses those terms. And so when I hear people say, well, it's not about fear, right? I don't wear a mask because I don't fear. My concern is simply this. That might be where your faith is at. But are you being a stumbling block? Are you hindering possibly somebody else's growth in their walk with Jesus? When you read Paul and you dive into 1 Corinthians, you start to see the same issues that we're facing today. The devil wants to divide us. Yeah. I think early on I heard people say that the devil wants to destroy the church by not allowing us to worship ever again. Now, and that could be certainly true. But I think the devil's number one tool is to divide the church. I think the devil says, if I can split Christians, if I can make Christians leave one church because they're upset with that and go to another church, and that church, Christians leave that church and go to another church, if I can divide them, if I can scatter the flock, right, then I know I've got victory. And so I think we really need to respond in this season with a humility and what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2, to consider others greater than yourself. And I hope that everybody does that. I hope that when we have this conversation here and people watch this, that they don't think that St. Mark's has everything figured out, or that you or I have everything figured out. I hope that they hear that our primary concern is how to go about loving people to Jesus, and how the best way to do that is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You and I have had many conversations about this and are very much on the same page with this. And we were talking earlier about the fact that it's very much like washing feet. You know,
Yes,
that it is humbling, it is the work of a servant, it's what we do. Almost that the face mask is now the towel.
Yes, correct.
In this
Yes.
time and in this
Yeah.
place. It really is. And it's just what we do.
Yeah.
Now, we haven't, certainly we haven't, and nor will we figure out everything, but we have some exciting things coming our way.
Yes.
With worship, we have a number of things that have been renovated in the Life Worship area. What are you looking forward to in these next months?
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to everyone knowing that we're doing everything in our power to offer worship services that allow people to come and worship in a healthy and safe environment. So we're social distancing, we're wearing masks, but we, in between services, what most people don't know is that, you know, we filter all the air, and I think Jim goes around and sprays down chairs and sanitizes surfaces and things like that. But you know, in the process, we are having some really dynamic worship services, and people are coming, and we're filling up. And so we're going to pivot however we need to pivot to make sure that we offer enough worship services for people to come and safely worship here. And we want people to know that, you know, that is our priority. We want to be welcoming in that way and saying, we've really done our due diligence to get you in here in a way that you can worship with your family, you can experience the power of worship and the presence of the Spirit. And we're also launching live streaming in December. And so our live streaming project here is wrapping up. So in this whole season, what God is doing that's new is online ministry here at St. Mark's. And I think, again, God can make beautiful and good things out of some of the worst times in life. And so that's what we're seeing here at St. Mark's. We have an online community that is joining us, and not just from Cedar Rapids, but from around the country, which is really fun to see. And so we have taken the time to really focus in on that, and you'll see some new changes in our sanctuary, some cameras and other things like that. But we have a whole group of people that's really excited to be part of this welcoming, worshiping community online. Yeah.
Well, Pastor Paul, thank you. Thank you so much for this time, and thank you for your leadership and your partnership in ministry. It is just a pleasure to be working side by side with you and our amazing staff.
Yeah. And this is a lot of fun because you got to interview me. And
Absolutely.
That's great. Thanks.